So I notice in the personal and professional development industry, which is an industry that I work in, that we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about leadership styles and communication styles and personality types and preferences, and yet we never talk about basic human temperament, which is that hardwired predisposition, almost like it has no effect on who we are or how we experience our life and our challenges. And I think it's a really important and missing piece of the dialogue, so I'm going to bring it into the dialogue a bit today. So, if you think about human temperament, it is that hardwired predisposition to experience things in a specific way. And we all fall on a continuum from somewhere between very bold to very timid. And if you are someone who is hardwired to be very timid, you'll find that you have a very sensitive central nervous system. You'll find it doesn't take a lot of stimuli to trigger a response. And stimuli can be anything from something that's happening right now, like giving a TED Talk. I'm having a response to that. And stimuli can even be something that you imagine happening in the future, like an argument you know you need to have in the future. Seek out Pat's help for that. Okay? So timid people have a strong response to stimuli, so we get a lot of adrenaline, a lot of epinephrine, so we have a strong fear response. That fear response is the thing that makes our knees shake or our hands shake. It's that thing that when something scares you, you can feel nauseous. And when timid people have a fear response, it can take them a long time to recover physiologically from that stimulation. Now contrast this person to someone who's on the very bold end of the temperament spectrum. Bold people are cool because they have a really natural built-in confidence, because their nervous systems are not as sensitive to stimuli. So it takes a lot of stimuli to get a fear response out of a bold person, and when they have a fear response, it can feel a little more like a rush. This is why we have our thrill seekers and our adrenaline junkies, right? They have to go out on purpose, put themselves in dangerous situations just to get that rush that makes them feel alive and alert and energized. And so intuitively, on some level, you already know this stuff, right? If you had animals, pets have temperaments, if you've had small children, and I say if you've had small children or pets, or if you've been around them, because as adults, we try to cover, but animals and small children don't. I know even with my own kids, about 10 years ago now when they were young, my son, when he was about 3, if I would push him on the swing in the backyard, and I would push that kid as hard as I could, and it was always higher, higher, higher. And I think unless I found a way to push him hard enough to flip all the way around that top bar, he wasn't going to be satisfied, right? He's a pretty bold kid. Now, contrast that with my daughter, a few years later, same age, and if I pushed her a little harder than she intended or I intended, she'd throw her hands up in the air, start crying, and ask to be taken off the swing. Now, I don't interpret their different response to that exact same stimuli to their gender necessarily, but they're definitely wired differently. And so if you think about the vast ways that all people on this continuum experience fear and experience the day-to-day stimuli in our lives, it's a very different experience. And yet we talk about fear in the personal and professional development industry like it's this one thing that we all have in common. And I think, that's really misleading. I think it also, in a kind of subtle way, has created the sense of shame for people that fall on the timid end of the spectrum. So probably with the word shame ringing in my ear, an okay time to admit I am on the timid end of the spectrum. And it didn't really matter in my first career. I came straight out of graduate school and I went into higher ed, had Pat as a colleague actually. And in the higher ed system, if you've never worked in one, they're awesome, primarily because they're very predictable. They have a lot of hierarchy, there are a lot of rules, there's protocol for everything. Academic years repeat, so a lot of your job is the same year after year. At least that was my experience in my department. And so I was very happy there. I felt successful and I was promotable, and all was well until something really bad happened. No, I didn't lose my job. I turned 30, and happens to all of us, right? And actually turning 30 wasn't the bad part. But when I turned 30, I did what I think a lot of people do on those milestone birthdays. I started questioning whether I was really where I wanted to be. And the answer was no. And so when I started dreaming about, okay, if this is not what I want my life to look like, what do I want my life to look like? I started dreaming about 3 things. Starting a business, because I had no business background. How could that fail? I started dreaming about having a life that had horses in it, because while I had never been around horses, I was certain I would love it. And I started dreaming about travel. And so being a kind of timid person, or a reserved, I like the word reserved better, reserved person, and having these kind of bigger, bolder dreams is A-okay, not a problem. Until then you realize you actually have to do something to make those dreams come true. And it was that day when I was paralyzed with fear that I realized something pretty big was going to have to shift if I was going to go from where I was to where I wanted to be. And I've learned 3 things in the past 9 years and 9 and 7/8 years that have helped me get from where I was to where I am, and I'm going to share them with you today in hopes that wherever you find yourself on this continuum, if you feel like the dreams that you have for yourself are bolder than you are, these might help you get there. Rule number 1, I'm actually not a rule girl, but this is actually a rule. Rule number 1 is that you simply have to make fear your very best friend. Because being timid means you're going to experience a lot of fear. And you can make fear your best friend, cuddle up to that sucker, right, by just saying yes to every opportunity that crosses your path that scares you. This is how I ended up here today, by the way. So what you'll find happens as you start learning to say yes to fear, this is something I've done for 10 years, and you'll find that there are ranges when it comes to fear. If you're in the 0 to 3 range in terms of fear, you're in your comfort zone. I love my comfort zone. When you're in your comfort zone, you're happy, you're content, life is good, it's okay to be here, but when you are here, you are not growing and you are not becoming bolder. So okay to be here, but if you're here all the time, you will not get where you want to be. What I have also learned, yes, the hard way, which is apparently the only way I'm capable of learning, is that there is a fear range of like 8, 9, 10, and that is where you are really, really fired up with fear. It is okay to say yes to things in the 8, 9, 10 range. I'm here again. But if you say yes to things in the 8, 9, 10 fear range all the time, life becomes very stressful. So for me personally, and you're going to have to figure this out for yourselves, I can say yes to an 8, 9, 10 fear range about once a month and think life is okay. If I say yes to something up here every week, let alone every day, I start to hate my life. And that is not the point of this talk, right? So for me, there's kind of that mid-range where you're not in your comfort zone, you're stretching, you're growing, but you're not completely weighed out with stress and overfaced by your life. If you can push yourself to be in this zone as much as possible, pretty cool things start to happen. So I think it's cool to set your goals and your objectives in this range, but even if you don't do that, even if you just take luck and circumstance and things that cross your path as opportunities and say yes to anything in this range and maybe some of that stuff, cool things start to happen. A few examples of things I've said yes to that have gotten me where I am. I had it, and this was a cool coincidence, about 3 months after I decided, I hadn't actually told anyone yet, but I decided I wanted to investigate what it would mean to have a life with horses, whether that means cleaning someone's stall or petting a horse, or I didn't know what that meant yet. And I got a phone call from a woman who said, there's this really nice horse for lease about 10 minutes from your house where I just moved. Would you be interested in looking at him? And it was a random call. And my first thought was, you can lease a horse? She said, yeah. And I said, okay. So I had never been around horses, didn't know how to ride, didn't know anything. And I said, well, that's kind of scary. So people, we're in training. Yes, if it's scary, you say, yes, good. And so I go and look at this horse. His name is Rocher. And of course, I immediately fell head over heels because how could you not look at him? And so I not only leased him, I leased him for a couple of months, and then I actually bought him and took him home. And so here's we still own him. He's actually my daughter's horse now. But here's the truth about saying yes to fear. Sometimes the things you fear happen, right? So what's the fear with horses? It's getting hurt, right? And I've had my fair share of bumps and bruises, as have my daughter. And I will still say you can't have the things that you're afraid of and not also get things that are awesome. So in addition to the occasional bump and bruise, I've had moments of bliss and learning and passion for my sport and a safe place to de-stress for 10 years, and it's made more difference than anything I've done in my life. So even though I took him home, had no idea what I was doing, had no idea how I was going to pay for it, and yes, there have been some consequences, it's also been a fabulous thing for me to say yes to. Another phone call that I got, lesson number 2, always answer your phone. Don't let it go to voicemail. Was a phone call from a guy that I had met in the biotech industry where we both work, and I considered him actually kind of a quasi-competitor, so I was wondering why he was calling. And he asked if I'd be willing to go to lead some leadership training, the content of which I didn't write and wasn't totally familiar with, in a company that I'd never heard of, in a city I'd never heard of. And so I thought, oh my gosh. So I was scared, so of course I said, yes. Sure, sounds like fun. And had the fear been, gee, this guy seems unstable, I hope he doesn't chop me up into little pieces and send me home in a box somewhere, maybe I should have said no, but that wasn't really what I was afraid of. The fear for that is, you can guess it, fear of failure. Fear of doing something stupid in front of his important client, a fear of letting a competitor know I'm not as good as he is, right? There's all these fears. And so I say yes, I go, I rewrite my content that I was responsible for at 2 o'clock in the morning, got the best scores he'd ever gotten on this retreat material, and we ended up going into business together. So I'd already been an entrepreneur for about 8 years at the time, but ended up forming a joint venture that has opened up some doors for me to do some things professionally that I always wanted to do. So it's been a fabulous opportunity, even though it was a little scary. The last example of things, again, a phone call from a woman a couple of years ago who invited me to go on a trip she was organizing to a little island in the Bahamas where they take you out actually on a catamaran every day, and they give you a mask and fins, and they plop you into the ocean to swim with wild pods of dolphins. And I think dolphins are awesome, so I said yes without even thinking. And this is where I guess I was just short-sighted. I didn't really think about the realities of this, but they plop you into the ocean. And I didn't think about it until about 2 weeks before I left, when the trip was already paid for. And so I get there, and I'm having some anxiety because I'm actually afraid of the water. And I'm actually more afraid of the things that are in the water. And I have a radically irrational fear of sharks. And they're in the ocean. So I'm working through that, and then we get there, and I'm in the ocean, and I was anxious. And then it was, oh my gosh, the jellyfish. And all of that was what it was. But then, couldn't have predicted this, a little thing called Hurricane Sandy. Yeah, in the Bahamas, and you saw the death toll in the Bahamas. And what was wild about that, so again, the lesson that you say yes to things that scare you, you get wonderful things out of it, and sometimes you have to also face the consequences of the thing you were afraid of. And I'm not totally afraid of hurricanes, I guess, but there was a moment on the island when there was no communication. When they couldn't get us off, you had to be flown in on private plane in and out of this island. The planes couldn't fly. There was no phone, there was no internet, cell phones did not reach this island, and I was completely out of communication with my children. And that scared me, because I knew they'd be watching the news, and I knew they knew where I was, and I knew they'd be seeing things, and I wasn't sure if they would think I was okay. I wondered if they knew I was okay. And the idea that for a period of about 48 hours that I could not protect my children from the reality of not knowing if I was okay freaked me out. And I'm in my hotel room, and I'm crying, and I'm thinking, how do I communicate to them that I'm okay? And because I wasn't actually that afraid of the hurricane, I was afraid of my children worrying about me in the hurricane. And there's that moment where, so here's the gift, right? I realized I couldn't control every experience my children had. As much as mothers want to do that. It's what we're wired for, right? I had to trust that how I'd raise them would prepare them to handle things like being worried. And I had to trust that other people who were with them could coach them through that. And when I was able to let go of my feeling responsible for something I could not control, I was able to really focus on my own experience, which ended up, I spent a lot of time in the meditation room until I could do nothing but sleep. I slept through most of the storm, woke up, everything was fine. But again, sometimes the things you're afraid of happen, and there's great opportunity in learning in that as well. So I felt like that trip changed me in some ways that I can only describe as spiritual. Okay, so enough of the heavy. So I picked these pictures because this is my young horse Zen, who I took to a Swim with Your Horse clinic a couple years ago. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But here's the cool thing. So saying yes to things that scares you means you will have more fear in your life. And that's okay. Because the trap people fall into is thinking, gee, I have this thing. I mean, we have all these inspiring ideas today of all these things we could do, all the difference we could make. And people have this idea that here's this huge thing I want to accomplish. And I will do that the minute I've talked about it long enough or thought about it long enough that I don't feel afraid anymore. And then as soon as that happens, I'm going to go do it. And if that is the trap you are stuck in your life, you will wait until the day you are dead and you will not have done it. Because fear comes from the lower brain. And the lower brain you can think of almost like a pre-programmed computer or an alarm clock even, right? I can tell my lower brain, just stop feeling afraid so I can go do this thing. That's like telling your alarm, please don't go off at 8 in the morning, even though that's where I set it, right? Good luck getting your alarm clock to change its mind. The lower brain can only be reprogrammed through experience, which means if you're afraid of it, you've got to do it and do it and do it until you stop feeling afraid. And what you're doing then is giving the lower brain new data that says, oh, look, I did it and I didn't die, right? So over time, you will become much bolder. So what I can say after 10 years of living this way is the things that I was afraid of last year, I don't think are a big deal today. The things I was afraid of 5 years ago, I think, okay, I have to roll my eyes at that. The things I was afraid of 10 years ago, I would never, ever admit in a public forum. Okay? So if you commit to doing these things you're afraid of, you will become much bolder over time. I would have never, first of all, water, hello, there were fish in that water. Not to mention horses, but I would have never swam with a horse. It was scary. And you can see in the one picture, I'm smiling, but I'm also like, whoa, dude, what are you doing? Because he was a little unpredictable. He liked to buck in the water. I don't know what that was about. But we also had these moments that were like the coolest moments I think I've ever had with my horse, and I've had a lot of cool ones. So, desensitization. The what? So here's how I can explain. I think Donnie was talking about it as the why. I think of it as the what. The what is the thing you're willing to fight for. And I can explain the what super fast in this way. If you picture you go home tonight and you open up your front door and there's an intruder in your living room, what do? You run. In case you didn't know, run away, right? You run, you make a phone call, you call for help, you put as much distance between you and that point of danger, that thing you're afraid of as you can. I think this is a good thing to do, right? But now I want you to picture you go home tonight and you open your same front door and you see that same intruder and your two small children are on the other side of him. Now what do? Bring it on. Right? The most dangerous place in the world to be is between a mother and her children. I'm sure it's the same for dads, right? You do what you have to do with that intruder to save those children because you care about their safety more than you care about your fear of that person. And so when you're asking yourself to do things that are outside of your comfort zone that scare you, it can help to have something that is more important than the thing you're afraid of that is worth fighting for. It's, I'm willing to do this for the sake of what? Right? So mine are super simple. I think everything should be as simple as possible. For work, because I have to have some difficult conversations with some frankly difficult people from time to time. I don't like conflict any more than anyone else. I would never want Pat's job, right? But I can do that if that means making life better for thousands of people in the middle to bottom of organizations and their families, because we get some things straight at the top. That is what gets me out of bed. It is what makes me have these tough conversations with difficult people. My reasons, I know them. They're personal, obviously. You don't need to know them. You need to know the reasons your what is important. My what for travel is pretty simple. I hit chronic professional burnout. Went there, got the t-shirt, don't ever want to go back. I vacation like it's my religion, right? So no question about the travel. That's my what, is just not burning out. And my what, and at the risk of competing with my horse who's better looking and frankly more charismatic than I am, there's a video where you'll see moments of my what. Now, I am a competitive person. I think I actually have been called hyper-competitive. It's probably true. I like to compete. I like to win. This is my sport horse, Zen, who you saw in the picture. This is actually when he was a baby. And you can tell he's a baby because he's on the wrong lead the whole time, and he's scrawny and ornery. Actually, he's still that ornery. So this was about 5 years ago, and he's a dressage horse. My goals for dressage are to be a Grand Prix level rider, which is a high level of riding and dressage. I don't know that we'll ever make it. I don't even know that it ever matters. Because when we set goals, goals are a destination. Goals are a place we want to get to. Goals are often about our egos, right? I like to compete. I like to win. And I don't think goals are as motivating at getting you to face your fears as the more meaningful, heartfelt what. So the what for the horse journey, even though I actually broke a bone falling off this one. And there are moments with horses that are still scary. And I get back in the saddle every day because there are moments where we learn to connect, where I learn his language, where I learn to build his trust, where we learn to partner in a way that's so subtle and so positive that he loves it as much as I love it. And you can see these moments. Again, he's a baby, he's young. I didn't know a lot about young horses at this time. And you can see it's just starting to make this connection. And so my what for him doesn't have anything to do with blue ribbons. It doesn't actually even have anything really to do with dressage. It's just the sport that I like the most. It's about connecting with something bigger than me and different than me and developing a language that's unique to us so that we have the kind of partnership together that makes him, when he's at the outside of the pasture and I call his name, he runs and he's ready to do his job because he loves working with me as much as I love working with him. That is the what. And I had a what for today. And when I was invited to throw my hat in the ring for a TED Talk, and my stomach sank, and I went, oh. So, of course, I said, yes. You're so well trained. Good. And the thing that made me follow through on it and go through the audition and the practices and the coaching, even though this is an uncomfortable context for me to speak in, was that I have a sense there's someone in the room that has a dream that might feel bigger than they feel they are right now. And my sense is if there is just one thing, one sentence, one principle, one idea, one example that makes one person do something that has them fulfill a dream that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have, it will make all of this worth it. It'll make it worth it that I'm going to wake up tomorrow with what Brene would call a big, fat vulnerability hangover. And so my request for each of you is to do what you can to make yourself that person, take one principle, apply it to your life, and achieve something amazing. Thank you.